So I'm excited to talk to you guys today. As he mentioned, I am at Knotch, the head of people there. We are a post-Series B content intelligence platform, or basically a MarTech platform, primarily focused on enterprise level Fortune 1000 companies working in the content space. In 2019, we closed our Series B, we were 25 people, and we've since doubled in size. So definitely in the hyper-growth stage of a company, or of the startup rather, even though the company itself is 5 years old. So it's kind of what I call a mature startup in the sense that they feel older from the years of experience, but still learning new things, and the hyper-growth is really just happening now. I've worked at 4 startups in my career. I've been employee number 5. I've been employee number 125, but it definitely still felt like a startup, and there was very little process in place. So one thing I know that is always a pain point when it comes, at least on the HR side, but also I think within an organization, is performance management with a startup. I think it's a challenging thing to accomplish. And so I'm going to talk about revamping the one-on-one strategy, kind of talk about OKRs, KPIs, and what I've coined as micro goals, because I'm bad at naming things, but you'll kind of understand what it is as I break it down. But I wanted to start with basically what's working against startups, because I think it's important to kind of articulate what are some things that are working against startups when it comes to setting clear performance metrics or having a clear performance management process. So one is obviously rapid growth, which we've talked about a lot. But when you're building the plane as it's flying, it's hard to kind of put pen to paper on exactly what the performance metrics are for each individual person. And if you do put pen to paper because you really want to do it, you're probably going to change and evolve it a lot over time. The second thing is changing and pivot. So we have a saying at our company that we want, basically we want to embrace change. We want people to face change head on and look at it as an exciting opportunity versus a mindset around resisting change, resenting change, and kind of getting angry by every change that happens. And so obviously companies are going to pivot. We've pivoted. We've obviously been open for 5+ years, and we are now in our hypergrowth stage now. That is due to certain pivots in the product, pivots in what we do. And that's understood, but I think that does create a challenge when it comes to performance metrics, because there is that expectation that if you set that OKR, are you just gonna pivot in 3 months? Is this even gonna be relevant? So there kind of can be that resentment or that resistance to process because they understand that the environment will change. And so it's important to create policies and processes that are malleable, that are flexible, and can be embraced with change, or embrace change rather. Third, flat structures. Our organization is still pretty flat in the scheme of things. We have a leadership team of 9 people, but that's because each individual team is a team of 5 to 10 people that the manager is managing. So we haven't really umbrellaed the organization yet. And so because of that, managers are spread pretty thin when it comes to weekly one-on-ones. Meeting with 10 people can take up 3 days. As well as that deep connection that you might have on a team. Like I have a team of 2 people. I see them every day. I sit across from them. It's easy to kind of blow that off as I know what they're doing. I know how they're feeling. The one-on-one can feel a little repetitive. So how can you create kind of a need for that one-on-one? Because the employee, I can guarantee you, really wants it, even when you feel like you might not need it as a manager. Fourth is a small and mighty team. So understanding that the team, it might be small. We're 50 people. I still consider that small in the scheme of things. And so because of that, there is this close connection and this strong culture that you have, which is a benefit and a great thing. But it also can create that exact sense that I just spoke about, where you feel like you have a pulse check on the culture. You don't need to have those conversations. You might feel like some things are repetitive. And so the one-on-one can really become stale quickly, particularly for, let's say a sales role where they have a quota, they understand that quota, what more needs to be said. I hear that often from salespeople. And so finding ways in which you can utilize that strong connection to really have deep and meaningful conversations, particularly around personal growth. A small leadership team. So we're a team of 9 right now, but when I started, we were a team of 4. Our leadership team wasn't meeting. We weren't having leadership meetings. SLT wasn't a thing. And that's because we saw each other every day, and we kind of felt the same way, that what were we gonna have sitting in a room together? What was the purpose? When we started it, it even was kind of like a bitch session, for lack of a better word, because we hadn't shared common experiences about what the pain points were of being managers and what we were experiencing across the company. So when we started, it wasn't even really strategic at all. It was more just like, these are some pain points I'm experiencing. My team said this about the overall culture. And it really started the conversation. But because we didn't have that, there was kind of this loss of information flowing from the top to the bottom because there was no strategic cloud thinking that was being handed down to the information. So even though we had team and company goals, there was a disconnect between that communication of every team lead or every manager understanding what their goals were, but the individuals weren't understanding how their work day to day spoke to the larger picture. Jack of all trades versus specialists. So in a startup company, you might hire some specialists, but they're probably going to end up adapting to what I call a jack of all trades or be required to work outside of their job description. And so one challenge there is acknowledging, one, that someone's job description necessarily isn't what they do every day. There's probably a lot of side projects, probably a lot of things that they're asked to do, maybe onboard someone that's not necessarily in their job description because you don't have a lot of people. And so one thing that some performance metrics or even in one-on-ones don't always get acknowledged are those side projects. And I think a lot of things I hear feedback on the most from employees when it comes to employee engagement is celebrating the wins and even having conversations around the failures when it comes to the side projects as much as it is their day-to-day job. The worst thing I can hear as an HR person is that's not my job. Like, you don't want to hear that culture, particularly in a startup, because there are going to be several things that are outside of the scope of my job that I'm going to be asked to do because we have 50 people in our office. And then learning on the job. Young people typically are hired a lot at startups, but even if not young people, if you do hire specialists because you want that type of education or that leadership on your team, you're probably going to have to ask those specialists that specialize only in product marketing to also like help out at an event. That might not be something they've done before. That might not be something they want to do. And so how can you create performance metrics for them to understand that certain elements of their job might be their job for the next 3 months, might be their job indefinitely, might be their job for the next week. And how can you invigorate that into your one-on-one and into your performance metrics as well? And then last, Uncharted Territory. As I said before, flying the plane as it's kind of taking off is a difficult thing. And it's hard to tell someone you're going to be a director in 6 months when you don't have a director. It's hard to kind of give someone clear feedback when you don't necessarily know exactly what the next step is or what 10 million in revenue looks like because you haven't gotten there yet. And so the Uncharted Territory can make it difficult, and oftentimes I feel like the most feedback we get from managers is, how do I advise someone that's looking for a promotion when I don't know when that promotion will be possible? We're a team of 2. How can I tell my recruiter he's going to become a senior recruiter when I don't know what that even means? What is the elevation of his role besides just giving him a promotion to make him stay? So that's something that I think it's something that works against the startup, but it's something that you can utilize to really make sure that people are getting what they want to out of a startup. As Cindy said, most people do 2 years, but they're doing those 2 years for a reason. And most people come into the startup for the jack of all trades appeal or for the growth appeal. And so setting those expectations around what growth looks like within an organization. Are you a company that's going to give an inflated title to someone because that's important and that's what you want to value or that's what's going to keep them there past that 2-year mark? Are you a company that doesn't want to do that and wants strictly people that are just comfortable with whatever that's thrown at them and they handle it? I think that's something that's important to assess when it comes to the territory in which you chart. So first conversation is around OKRs. How many of you know about OKRs? I'm assuming everyone. 5 years ago, you couldn't go to a company that wasn't talking about the fact that they implemented OKRs or that was something that they utilize. Obviously created at Intel, popularized by Google, and something that really stuck to a lot of companies when it came to performance metrics. So obviously you have the objective, which is the well-defined goal. The idea there being that it's super specific, but it's also super challenging. You're not supposed to be able to just accomplish the goal overnight. And then the key results measure that goal. Usually you want it to be quantitative, a percentage. For example, your OKR could be, we want to have, your job is to expand our current client base or our current logos in the financial sector. And some key results could be 20% expansion of our current logos, 20% renewal of our current logos, 60% new business in the financial sector. So that'd be something that's super, super legitimate, super, super specific that you could say the salesperson did it or they didn't do it. Usually 3 to 4 was the magic kind of number that was kind of being utilized by most people. And it had a waterfall effect that was often used where the company would create their OKRs, Then the teams would go back and create their OKRs off of those goals, and then the individual created their goals off of the team goals, which in theory is great in the sense that the individual knew how their job, as Cindy mentioned, which is so important, spoke to the larger picture. Challenge there, obviously, is one, what I talked about when it came to change, and the fact that oftentimes in most of my startup experiences, an OKR I've either been assigned or assigned to someone else was no longer relevant, at least one of them by quarter's end. Two, you're addressing that by quarter's end, so you're not giving feedback necessarily in real time, and it's something that's usually forgotten about and or just kind of briefly talked about in one-on-ones and really deeply dissected, I guess, at the end of a quarter. And then the other aspect of it is kind of just the timeline. Like, let's be honest, company takes about a week to figure out what the company goals are. They roll it out to the company. The team leaders take about 2 to 3 weeks to finally roll out theirs to their teams. The individuals take another 1 to 2 weeks. By that point, you're a month and a half into the quarter. You have another month and a half to kind of get these goals done. And it kind of can be a delay. Also, if you're in a creative space at all, or if you have any creative people that aren't necessarily sales-driven or engineering tech stack, which obviously Google has a lot of, or Intel has a lot of, it can be challenging to add that quantitative piece to every role. Like an office manager, is it cutting costs by 25%? Like, what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the specific metrics you can utilize? It's sometimes very challenging, and it can be very limiting in scope to an individual. Second is KPIs, which I'm sure, again, how many of you are familiar with KPIs? I'm sure mostly everyone, which are key performance indicators. And even if you don't have KPIs, or even if your company doesn't utilize the phrase KPIs, you have an indicator of what success looks like in your role. Even if it's in an interview process when someone says, what does 1 year of success look like in this role? Or what would success look like after 90 days? That's a KPI. And usually they follow the SMART model, which is they're specific, measurable, achievable, so they're a little bit more obtainable than an OKR. OKR is supposed to be a little bit loftier. They're relevant and they're time-based. So some HR like KPIs could be like turnover rate, cost per hire, time to fill, retention rate, and you would kind of assign that in the sense of like time to fill cut in half by 20% quarter over quarter or something like that. So that would kind of add that time element, that specificity, but it's approachable. It's an actual feasible thing that you can measure, pretty black and white. An OKR can have some more gray area to it. You can make it a little bit loftier. You can say you kind of got it, or you got one key result, you didn't get the other two. But a KPI is like you did it or you didn't. And so that's a good plus for it. There also are team and individual KPIs, so it does tie things to your current team, but at the same time, oftentimes it is at quarter's end or year end, so there's not necessarily feedback in real time. Also, it can be limiting in the sense that oftentimes people feel like KPIs are the end-all be-all. So if they got all of them, they're doing great, they're getting a promotion. If they didn't do any of them, they're getting fired. And so it can really be limiting in the sense that they think that's only their job. So if you have that jack of all trades, they're like, that's not my KPI, not my job. And if they do other KPIs, they're like, you're saying I'm not performing well, or I'm not a culture ad, and I don't get it because I'm doing every KPI and I'm doing everything you asked me to do. So it can be limiting for a manager as well when it comes to performance management. And so this is where the term micro goals kind of comes into play. And basically at a leadership offsite, we said, OKRs aren't working, KPIs aren't working for us, we're not giving feedback in real time, people are waiting too long to get their feedback. How can we make these two adaptable to our culture? And so that's how micro goals came to be. Basically, weekly individual priorities that work towards the common goal. So basically, the company still rolls out that we still have the QBR, we still do our team goals, and the individual is contributing to that team goal week over week in the same waterfall effect. So it still does add to the bigger picture. They're 3 to 4 are the target number. Still lofty. You shouldn't accomplish everyone week over week because obviously they need to be challenging. And that kind of makes it also not a to-do. You want to refrain from to-dos like, I need to email everyone back. That should not be a priority. That should, but you should do that anyway. It should be challenging, difficult to obtain, but the plus side is you get immediate feedback week over week. It allows for changes and pivots. 1 week wasted is better than 1 quarter wasted. And so, hey, that's no longer relevant, let's move on. It's an easy conversation to have. It gives room for error. It's a lot easier to mess up 1 week in 7 or 5 business days than it is to mess up a whole quarter. There's a lot of weight there. And it allows the opportunity to also celebrate wins. One thing we heard a lot was that wins weren't being celebrated or weren't being remembered by quarter's end because you kind of forget what happens along the way if it's not documented. So this allows for an immediate response of, hey, you did a great job in that meeting last week, just so you know. And it can be both quantitative and qualitative. So you can say, I want to do a better job in pitches. That's not, that's not number-based, but that is an important skill set for people to learn and go to a meeting about or do a meetup where you talk about that. And then it can also be qualitative. It can be metrics-based, but just more on the granular level. It brings a freshness to goal setting. So an OKR can kind of be like, okay, we have a whole quarter to accomplish this. You kind of can get bored with it. Whereas this is week over week. It's a more exciting, shortened time frame. It acknowledges the side projects, but also personal development. So you can say, I really want to become a CFO. What are some things I can do over the next year to get there? And one might be like meet weekly with a mentor or do executive coaching, and you could add that element into your priorities. And it's easier for managers to track, which most of you probably are and or in the people space. And one thing is, it's hard to do one-on-ones. It's hard to make, and I love them, and I think they're really important, but it's even hard for me to do them and set the time aside to do them. And so it's really important that, particularly in a flat structure, if you have 10 direct reports, for example, which our head of revenue does, that he's able to provide this on a more granular level and add it to a meeting he's already having. Because it's really hard to set a separate meeting around performance, like a performance review or a quarterly review, than it is to have a weekly one-on-one, which you're already having, or a bi-weekly one-on-one. So I want to just quickly show it laid out like this. So basically, you have your weekly and bi-weekly one-on-ones where the direct report and the manager are setting their goals and priorities for the upcoming week. They're also reviewing what the goals were for the previous week and how they did. It provides that feedback loop where you get immediate feedback. We practice radical candor, which is basically, I'm sure you mostly know, but basically we provide criticism and feedback to our direct reports. They provide it back to us. And then our direct report has the opportunity to ask any questions. You make sure, are we on the same page? Do we understand what you're doing for the next week? Great, you document it. Then we do quarterly check-ins where basically you review week over week everything that happened that quarter. It's like 12 reviews, so it's not that difficult. You kind of sum it all together. You say that these are the major wins, these are the major losses, this is kind of the ongoing theme, or hey, you failed 4 weeks out of the quarter, like maybe make your priorities a little bit more obtainable or something like that. And that provides a little bit more documentation to kind of answer your question on how often a performance review should happen. We were doing them annual or biannually, and we felt like they were too frequent in the sense that everyone thought a promotion was what they were getting every time, and I had to say no. So now we do those annually, and this quarterly check-in process allows for us to have a touch point so that there are no surprises, as you can see at the bottom, which I didn't add because he said that, David, but no surprises because that is very important. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. If you have a question for Garrison, please raise your hand. Anyone? Okay, over here.
Hi, my name is Candace.
Hi, Candace.
Hi. My biggest challenge has been in and out of startups, is that I feel like people don't do this soon enough, and that, we start out with I was number 4 in the last one, and we put our heads down and try to get the work done, but when you don't do this, you lose people, less than 2 years.
Yep.
So how do you get buy-in sooner?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I'm fortunate that my company, when I came in, really cared about the people. Our CEO is a very business-minded individual. She's very honest about that, but she really values the importance of a strong culture. She's an immigrant, she's a woman in SaaS, and she really values the importance of making sure everyone belongs at a company. And it's not necessarily 100% her mindset, which is totally valuable. She's a business-minded person, and we need those people in the room. And so I've been fortunate in the fact that I've been able to have a voice in the room because I am kind of sometimes the opposing voice in the same way that finance is oftentimes that opposing voice in the room. And so that's been really fortunate to me. But I will say that there are a lot of resistance, particularly when it comes to revenue roles, because so much of that is black and white. Like you either made your quota or you didn't, and that's the end all be all. Why do you need to meet with a seller to tell them they're not meeting their goal? They know they're not meeting their goal. And so I think it's something that is important to adapt early on, particularly because most startups do hire young people, and there is a responsibility that companies need to accept. If you hire young people, you are responsible for their career and where they go. They will go to their next company and think that the way your company is run is how every company is run. So if they get promoted to, a VP of finance at 24, they're going to think that they're a VP of finance at Morgan Stanley. Like, that's just what they're going to do, and that's how that association happens. And so I think there is a responsibility that founders and people need to do a better job of really assessing, like, are we setting a foundation for this in the future? And know that when you hire young people particularly, or people that are in their first or second career, they're coming to a startup for opportunity, and they're coming for a startup to learn. They're not trying to come for knowing every answer. And so you have a responsibility, as you said, to really paint that picture early and make sure that everyone has buy-in to the fact that even though it may seem repetitive at first, move that one-on-one forward anyway, because you're doing it for the employee and not for the employer or for the manager. And I think one thing that I had to really change the culture of, and at Knotch specifically, was that understanding that making the employee understand that this is your time. You get 15 minutes in front of this person. In 2 years from now, when the company's 400 people, you might see that person once a week. And like at other companies, this is not necessarily the hands-on experience or as much hand to manager, like our, manager, I guess, face-to-face that you get at a large company. And so really setting that value and understanding that most people have not worked at a company before or have not worked at many companies before. And so they don't have something to measure that to, whereas we, or many people here, do. You can say, oh, this is completely different than my last job. Someone out of college can't say that. And so understand that a lot of people in the startup space are in their early career, and every big blow up is a big thing to them because they've never experienced it. Every first piece of feedback, and that's one thing about radical candor that can be kind of negative, is really harsh when your manager says you are not doing a good job if you've never been told that in another job before. And so I think it's acknowledging that piece is really important that I think sometimes gets glossed over. Any other questions? Yep. Sorry, can't see. Yep.
Hi, my name is Emily.
Hi.
My question is, this is a lot to roll out. I've actually been number one at a startup, kind of building out to 100 and something person company, and had the same kind of problems of figuring out how you implement, especially with really young leaders and managers.
Absolutely.
How have you gone about taking this kind of model and then making sure that it's understood for that person, whoever their manager is, how they roll it out and how they communicate, especially when it comes to that emotional intelligence side of like delivering feedback?
Totally.
And then documentation. Absolutely.
So one, I think from a young leadership perspective and young management perspective, they really do look to the founder. Even if the founder is fresh out of college, which some founders are, and some of the founders I've had the pleasure of working for are really smart people in the younger stages of it's their first company. But the leadership roles do carry a weight. And so I think that's an important thing for young leaders to really understand is the weight that they carry and like the presence that they carry and that transparency and that feedback that we share at our QBRs around like, hey, we really failed here. Or I will say, I said I would close these 5 roles and I didn't close 3 of them, and that's on me. And having that opportunity to fail publicly in an all-hands meeting has really allowed the employees to feel more safe doing that. So I think that's an important aspect of your question. I think the other thing is around, when it comes to adoption, is the reason why we tied it to a one-on-one is because that was already happening within our organization. So it was easy because we didn't have to add additional time. It didn't seem like extra work. And it was on the employee to really make sure that they were driving the priorities forward. And it was the manager's job to strictly track that. We're beneficial in the fact that our main feedback around performance management was that the employee wanted better self-management around their goals. Like they wanted to make sure that they were doing their job, because when you're in the weeds and you're just working blindly or answering emails or supporting clients, you don't know if you're actually doing well all the time. And so really our main piece of our feedback that we wanted out of the performance management that came out of our leadership offsite was, what are your goals week over week? Like, what are you actually tracking towards? How are you like relevant to the bigger picture? But then 2, how are you being told that you're doing a good job or doing a bad job? And one thing in startups that's often glossed over because we just don't have time to acknowledge it are those wins and are those losses. Oftentimes losses are probably more publicly known, as you've probably seen in the press with some companies lately. But wins are very, very important. And I think that that's something that does get glossed over because you're like, great, we closed a deal. Amazing, let's move on. Let's close another one. And so I think that's something that we've implemented. So It's a work in progress. It's definitely something that takes buy-in, and not every manager is great at it. The younger managers adopt it better because I think they understand this format actually because that's what they want still from their CEO or their VP. It's some of the more senior level people that just take longer because they're currently managing 10 people, whereas they probably should be managing 3 to 4. And so just understanding that. We've also it's forced us to have conversations around, because those leaders know that they can't manage 10 people effectively, we've actually created more team leads and more umbrella in our organization, which is necessary, that we've kind of been hesitant to do for various reasons because of this system. And just to shout them out, we do utilize 15.5 for this, which is actually kind of their philosophy in this way. So I can talk more about that, but that's what we currently use for the documentation perspective.
Last question.
Any more?
Hey, Garrison, thanks for keeping it raw and real tonight. I appreciate your experience in implementing this.
Yep.
Question I had is around development versus performance. And how you distinguish between the two, where performance definitely affects, let's say, promotion or pay, whereas development is more about innovation and creativity. I'm curious how you go about distinguishing that and tracking that in this system.
Absolutely. So one thing that's challenging in the startup space around kind of that conversation around growth potential is I think sometimes it's easy as a startup, and this is definitely startups I've worked for in the past, have been like, we have a COO. So you want to be a COO, but that's never going to happen because we have one. And I think when it comes to performance management, it really should be about past the organization. So I'm looking at an individual on what they want to do with their life outside of Knotch, outside of their career, or outside of their career right now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now. That's where performance management should come in. So I think oftentimes younger managers can limit that potential because they're like, they kind of feel threatened about their own job maybe, or there's some metrics around like, oh, that's years off. Let's talk about right now what you can do to get to the next phase. But performance management to me, in terms of kind of that career trajectory, where am I on the bigger ladder? I think remove that as much as possible, or I strive to remove that as much as possible from the current organization. I think there are elements to that do, like I want to be able to say, you're doing really well, you're gonna, or you're getting promoted. And I do want to keep some of it on that company level, but I think from a bigger picture, make people think bigger, make people think larger so they don't get so caught in the day-to-day of like, why am I not growing? I've been here 6 months. Or why am I not growing? I've been here a year. So I think really that's how I kind of try to separate it with the managers. I have them look, what does this person want to do in 5 years? What does this person want to do in 10 years? And how can they be working now to get there, even if it's casual meetings with our CFO or casual meetings with, this person or that person. So making those introductions and making that happen, that will speak more to that individual because they want buy-in for the future. Whereas I think on the day-to-day performance perspective, you really should separate that as much as possible early on from compensation, because people do often tie, if I'm meeting everything well at 1 year, because I've been told this, I will get a promotion. And at another year, I'll get another promotion. Or in 6 months, because I've taken on 4 side projects, I now deserve a raise. And so really setting those expectations around, we're really valuable for your work, we'll give you more, we give more spot bonuses, to be honest, because I think it rewards without, setting the expectation that everything will result in a raise. But I think that is something that's important to kind of separate in mindset. And I think that it's important to know that everything you're doing, as terrifying as this sounds, everything you're doing is setting precedent. And so I think tying it back to the firing conversation, if you let someone stay for 6 months, you're setting precedent that someone will be allowed 6 months. In the same way that if you fire someone immediately, you're setting the expectation that no matter what, if you F up one time, you're out. In the same way it comes with performance management. If you set the expectation that year over year people are consistently getting promoted, people will assume that promotion is happening. If managers see quarter over quarter that they're being asked to hire 5 people, they're always going to think that they're going to get 5 additional people on their team. And so just think about the precedent that you're setting and the scalability of what you're setting. And that's kind of the idea about the micro goals, is that it's scalable into an OKR, it's scalable into a KPI easily because it already utilizes those 2 kind of fundamentals to create it, if that makes sense.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, Garrison.
Thank you, guys.
Let's give him a huge round of applause. That was great.